It's a beautiful day to be able to connect in this way, albeit that we are in a virtual space. We are still connected. I'm going to talk about storytelling for this session as a method in research, and I'm going to be presenting it from my perspective as a community person, and maybe share a little bit about how I began to grow this, not just for myself, but in working with other people and in the research community. I want to tell you a little bit about that trajectory of how I became involved in research. And that goes back to a time when, when research was just starting to bubble up within the Indigenous community. There were only a handful of research projects that were being done on HIV and AIDS at the time that I became curious. Curiosity is good. And I became curious about what was out there. And I was curious to find out what kind of research was being done that could potentially support somebody like me, an Indigenous woman living with HIV who had been tested late at the AIDS stage. And, I know one of the things that I quickly found out was that there was very little support for women at that time and in terms of the services that were being provided. So I looked to the research to find out what they were doing in terms of creating that bit of a forward moving trajectory, and to also see what kind of supports were being discussed through their research. And so I started attending research conferences. And there were key words that were jumping out at me when I was listening to researchers present on our community, on our Indigenous IPHA community. And there were words that were always being used. And those were deficit words. I didn't articulate it at the time, but they were words that really unpacked the trauma in our lives and continually unpacked that. And those words were jumping out at me when I was listening to researchers present on us. And I thought, hey, why do they keep talking about all of this again and again? Is that the only thing that can be talked about? And around that same time, with the few research projects that were happening for our community, they were using focus groups, what they called a focus group. I remember being invited to a focus group and thinking, oh, what is a focus group? And they would bring us together for these focus groups and ask a bunch of questions. And then promise us, okay, our discussion today, you'll see, we'll send something back about the results of this discussion. Quite often, we never saw anything coming back to us from those focus group sessions. And that was kind of worrisome. And so I just want to kind of mention that's kind of when I came into research. I've never really considered myself a community-based researcher because I'm still connected to my community of my peers, and the network that I've nurtured over the years. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about why I got into research and what I saw in terms of the unpacking of trauma and deficit. And what kind of hurt as well was to see our own people also doing that. I mean, it was also around the time when the Royal Commission report had already been released. And it was also around the time that our communities were beginning to talk about the residential school legacy and colonialism and making those connections. So of course, we had to talk about those things so that we could understand it. But is that all we were going to talk about? could we also talk about those things that made us strong and talk about our strengths and the beautiful stories that each of us carry? Because storytelling, if you do a search, even in Google, you can do a search. And some of you might have access to a library as well, where you can access scholarly articles that are written about storytelling. But even in Google, if you were to input scholarly articles on Indigenous storytelling, a whole bunch of articles will pop up. And and some of you might have access to libraries where you can actually do searches on Indigenous storytelling as a research method in Indigenous community-based research. I'm a curious person. So even then, like after that, hearing all those presentations and reflecting on it and thinking about it, I thought, well, I'm going to talk to my peers. I'm going to talk to other Indigenous women and find out, like, how they felt about this, the way we were being presented. And because at the time, I felt like I was doing my own exploratory kind of, research in my own little, as a community person. And so I began to speak to other women, and they too had the same thought, that too much time was spent on only presenting on our trauma and highlighting the deficits. There was very little that talked about our strengths. There was one word though that was consistently used, and that was the word resilient. So I'll just give you an example of a presentation, perhaps a scenario of going to a research conference and hearing somebody present on us, Indigenous people living with HIV, and unpacking all the trauma and highlighting that they collected this information through focus groups and then presenting on it and highlighting all of that. And then at the end, their big conclusion always was, but they're resilient. That was quite often the conclusion to a research project that was unpacking the pathogenic story about Indigenous people. And during the presentation as well, sometimes as trauma was being unpacked, everybody was listening to it. And you'd hear little, you'd see people in the audience, because I'm very observant as well. So I'd see how people were taking it in, and I would see people going, "Aw," or even crying, and shedding a little tear. And then, but when the conclusion came, but they're resilient, but they're resilient, everybody would clap. And I thought, well, that kind of sucks. We're more than we're more than the story that was just told about us. We're more than that. So I did a 13-city cross-country process. I called it a consultation at the time, just to hold conversations with Indigenous women living with HIV in those 13 cities. And it also included speaking to the service providers, healthcare providers, and all the people that loved and supported us as a community of women. And this is what I was hearing from other women as well. Enough of unpacking these kinds of stories about us. So before I talk about Indigenous storytelling as a research method, I want to underscore what some of the scholars have said in terms of story. And maybe I'm mistakenly calling Thomas King the author, He's a prolific Indigenous author that has a huge body of work, and I've read most of his books. And he did a lecture called the Massey Lectures as part of the Massey All Lecture Series, and where he talked about story. And one of the things that I've often used of his quote is where he warns us that once a story is told, it is loose in the world. So you have to be careful with the stories you tell. And you have to watch out for the stories that you are told. And then there's an Indigenous scholar, Sean Wilson, who authored Just Ceremony. He also expressed that some stories, because of their sacredness, should not be revealed, because this strips them of their spiritual and sacred elements. To write them down is to transform them, to endanger them, and ultimately may serve to deactivate them. And that was published in an article by Haig Brown and Dannenman in 2002. And so when you do your searches, if you want to find out more about Indigenous storytelling as a method, there's a lot that's gonna pop up. I'm a curious person, and I've read a lot of articles just that way, and before I even got involved in research, I was perusing websites and reading what was out there and what was being presented. So I just wanted to kind of privilege that, give a bit of a backgrounder in terms of my own trajectory as a community-based researcher, which is a title that I never really fully thought of myself. When people called me a researcher, I'd say, wait a minute, I'm not a researcher, I'm community. And so I wanted to kind of just privilege that. So storytelling as a research method goes way back. And I remember one of the elders from my community, she was a prolific storyteller. And as a little girl, she would often, when I visit her or when I spent the nights with her during the winter months, I was asked to go stay with elders in the winter months that were living by themselves, so just to support them. And she was a prolific storyteller. And so when I say way back, I'm talking about time immemorial, where, story has had a significant importance for us as Indigenous people, because it is how we transmitted our knowledge, and passed it on. And so she used to start her stories all the time with Chisha. Go back. And depending on how long she elongated that word, Chisha, you'd know. If it was really long, like I just did, it was long time ago, is how she would start telling her story. So storytelling was utilized in our communities as a way to also acknowledge our connections. And there are two types of stories that are shared. So I'm just looking through my notes here. So there are like in the Western language, what the stories you might call mythical. And in Anishinaabe or in the Cree language, they're called, and the Cree pronounce it slightly different from what I'm saying. And that's those stories about the bush and Wisagejak, and in other territories, there's stories about Glooscap and Raven out on the west coast. And there's these different stories that are told about this being. And so those are Atsukan comes from spirit. So those stories come from spirit. And then there's the other types of stories that are the other type of stories that are like the personal stories. And by personal stories, I'm talking about people speaking to their lived experience, if we were to think about it in the research context. So those are the two types of stories. There's a third one as well, another type of story, but I'm going to focus on those two types of stories. One comes from spirit, and that's the Atsokat story, the mythical stories. And using the word mythical is even not a good thing for me, because it relegates it into a different place, much like how mainstream research will often look at the way we focus on storytelling as a method, and but it's grown. We've continued to use storytelling as a method in community-based research. So it's becoming more widely used, particularly in story circles. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about story circles, as some people will call them, or some people might call them talking circles, and some people might call them sharing circles. And there's also another circle that's, when we talk about these circles, there's a healing circle, there's a talking circle, and there's a sharing circle. And I've been hearing recently some researchers referring to this whole process as story circles, calling them that. So whatever you want to use when you design your research, like in terms of the methods you're going to use, read up on some of the differences in terms of the types of circles that you can use, because some you're advised not to use like a healing circle, and it kind of to collect data. And in the last probably decade, or maybe in the last, about decade, when we started using circles as part of the data collection, there was some pushback. Because usually when you hold one of these circles, whichever type of circle you're holding, usually one of the things that is said at the beginning of the sharing circle or the healing circle or the talking circle is that what's said in this space stays in this circle. What's said here stays here. So there was a bit of pushback in terms of using sharing circles as a research method in Indigenous community-based research. But then there was an agreement, and some people started using sharing circles. It was agreed upon that we could go ahead and call them sharing circles, with the understanding that when you conduct your sharing circle, that you let them know that you're using this method, this Indigenous storytelling method, to collect your data. Although I wouldn't say data when I'm sitting in the circle, I wouldn't say we're here to collect data. There's more a different way that you can actually say that, because data is it could potentially be one of those dirty words in our community. Oh, they're extracting information.
Yeah, it's like no-go zone. Yeah, you got to be more so open and soft with the language. It's like, yeah, we're going to extract all that information from your brain today.
Yeah. So when you use the story circles, I really like the name story circles as a research method, because I've used sharing circle as a research method in the past with the visioning health study. That's what we used. But lately, one of our elders at Feast actually corrected us and said, no, it's talking circles. And that actually makes more sense, because when people are, they might be sharing things that they don't want to end up on any transcript. you know. It's a sacred, all these circles are sacred spaces because we're coming together in a circle, in a sacred circle, and asking some questions. And usually for a sharing circle, you know, don't come to your sharing circle with 10 questions. You know, you're in terms of your research design, you know, we're always required to at least have maybe up to 4 questions for a research study. And so those are the questions that you take to the circle. So, and 3 questions are usually good. Like if you've got 15 people sitting in the circle, it's going to take some time to ask 4 questions of each person that's in the circle. But the other thing that we also did when we started a circle, once there was buy-in and we were given the go-ahead to call them sharing circles by knowledge holder communities, you know, that said, yes, as long as you articulate that you're using it for that at the beginning, when you start each sharing circle, as long as you tell the people that are coming into that circle to share their, to answer the questions, as long as you tell them we are using this sharing circle for research, and you have an elder, you always have an elder with you as well, and that elder is there to support that whole process and begin the circle. Usually as a facilitator of one of these circles, I would sit with an elder and I would be facilitating, but the elder would do the opening, and so nobody usually interrupts anybody when they're talking in the circle. You kind of lay that out at the beginning, you know, what you're going to be doing, and you know, whoever has the talking stick or the rock, they're the ones that have the floor, and nobody will interrupt them as they're responding to a question. And but I would also tell them at the beginning, the only one that can interrupt them is the person asking the question. If I want to, like when they're done, I might jump in and ask them for a follow-up to give to question on something they said. And so if you've got 4 questions, it could take a couple of hours to get through in the circle. And so, and the reason why this is important, like in research lingo, it's called qualitative research, right? That's what they call the lived experience story. It's qualitative research. It's about story. And it's really important because people within the circle are able to tell the story in their own words and from their own experience. And it's a little different from if you're doing like a survey and you're collecting quantitative data. That's different. And we're not even going to talk about that for this session. That's another conversation. So what I wanted to do sometimes to be a little time efficient within that circle as a facilitator was I would sometimes ask each individual all 3 questions, one after the other, and then go around. So we'd go around once and all the 3 questions were asked. Or I would choose to go 1 question each round. So we would go 3 times around for each of the 3 questions. And then we wouldn't end there. We would go do 1 more round and ask, is there anything else that people might have wanted to talk about or missed in articulating? And we're going to go around 1 more time if there's anything more that people want to add to respond to these questions. And so we would go 1 more round, and sometimes people would just pass it pass the talking stick to the next person. But sometimes it picked up new information, you know, that that person might have wanted to kind of share. So that was the way we did the story circles. I'm gonna start calling them story circles. And one of our feast team members, I actually got that from her. She's done quite a number of story circles. And so stories, and elders are really important when you're doing your research. You probably know that, some of you already, how important they are. You know, when I described what we did, like the elder supported me in that circle as the person asking the questions, because she understood what we were doing, but she was also there to support the people in the circle. And so if anything kind of went, if somebody was triggered by something, you know, the elder was there. And but in my case, the questions I was asking were strengths-based questions. So I try not to, as a researcher myself, I try to frame all questions to get that story, to kind of reframe a story in a way, like help them to reframe that story so that it comes from a strengths-based place. And so as an example, the questions that we asked, envisioning health 1, envisioning health 2, they were the same questions. What does health look like for you? What does health look like for you as an HIV positive Indigenous woman? And how, the second question, how does culture support your health as an HIV positive Indigenous woman? I didn't ask about their trauma. And we brought in culture in terms of how culture supported their health. And I think when you ask those kinds of questions, the story is going to be different. The story that you're going to elicit from the circle, the people in the circle, are going to be very different. It's a different entry point than if I were to ask them about their trauma, about how they manage their lives living with HIV, with multitude of challenges. As soon as you start using some of those words, you kind of set the stage for them to talk about their challenges. So I avoid those kinds of words. I just want to hear about your health. What does your health look like for you? And you know, so that really helps in terms of framing that story that comes out of that story circle. It's a different entry point. It's not, and it's also honoring them, because in that circle we're all sacred beings. We are all sacred beings. And that's why they use that word atsukan, those stories that come from spirit. And I just want to finish with, from the story, the son of Ayash is the story. And it's a story that was told in the language. And it's one of those epic, magical stories that come from our people. And there's all kinds of stories. The nations, all our nations have their own creation stories. And we have our heroes in those stories as well. And so I just want to finish with an excerpt from the legend of the son of Ayash. And so Ayash, because the story is called Son of Ayash, he never has a name in the story. He's referred to as son of, his father's name is Ayash. And so he's referred to in the story as the Ayash's son of Ayash. And in the language, people would say, Ayash, Kusisan, son of Ayash. So in this story, after he'd been abandoned by his father on this island, he met up with the thunder beings. He met up with Mishibaju, the water serpent, because he was stranded on this island where he'd been banished to and abandoned by his father. I'm not going to go into the reasons why he was abandoned there, but it was kind of like in today's context, if people are the son of Ayash was falsely accused and banished on this island. So he was our hero in this story. And he met up with the thunder beings. He was sitting by the shore of that island. And the only other life that was on that island was, of course, the plants and seagulls, birds were living on that island because they had come there. His father had brought him there to say, we're going to go there to this place and get some seagull eggs, because people liked eating them. So they were there. They went there on that fake mission that his father told him, that's where we're going. But he was just going there to abandon him and banish him. So he makes his way back away from that island, riding on the back of the Mishibaju, the sea serpent. That's in our stories. These are magical beings, and sea serpent tells the son of Ayash, if you see the thunder beings coming, starting to approach as they're, before they take off from that island, he says, you ride on my back, you hang on to my horns, and I'll take you to the mainland, away from this place. And maybe you'll find your people. And so, but you can ride on my back, but I have to tell you, while we're traveling, if you see the thunder beings approaching, you let me know by tapping on my horn real hard, and I'll know that they're close, and I'll know what we'll do. And so they're traveling on the water really fast, because the Mishibaju is very fast. And so the son of Ayash is riding on the back of Mishibaju, the water serpent, and they're traveling across this huge body of water, and to try and get him to the mainland. And then the sky begins to darken, and because the son of Ayash really wants to get home, he doesn't tell the Mishibaju that the thunder clouds are starting to roll in, and they continue to travel. And then it becomes really dark, like the clouds are over their head, and then you could see the thunder beings in the clouds starting to make noise. And so they were an enemy to Mishibaju. And Mishibaju was very cautious with them because they could kill him. And so they started flashing, and lightning started to come towards them. And the son of Ayash didn't tell the water serpent, Mishibaju, that this was happening. And they were still traveling. And then the thunder beings just hit Mishibaju. And Mishibaju, they went flying. And the son of Ayash went flying and landed on this, because they were getting close to land. And that's why he wasn't telling them. So when they got hit by the thunder beings, the son of Ayash went flying through the air and landed on the beach of the land. And Mishibaju was killed. And so the son of Ayash sitting on the beach and shocked and regretting that he didn't tell Mishibaju that the thunder beings were nearby. as he was instructed. And so he's sitting there crying on the beach. And then this little drop of blood comes next to him. And it's almost like it's got life, and it moves and it enters into the water. And he's very curious, so he decides to follow it. And he follows that drop of blood underwater. And so he's walking underwater in this great body of water. And see, there's the magic in our stories. Like when we hear that story being told, we pause our disbelief. Like we go with the story. And so there he's walking under the water, and off in the distance, he sees this little tiny lodge. And there's smoke coming out of the smoke hole of the lodge. And meanwhile, they're underwater. So you have to kind of pause your, disbelief, because you're in the story. And so as he gets closer to that little tiny lodge, he hears somebody in there. And then he hears this voice that says, "I've been expecting you," and invites him in. He doesn't know who's talking to him. He goes into that little tiny lodge, and there's a little kokum in there. A little grandmother is in there, and she's sitting by this fire, and there's a little tiny pot hanging over the fire, and there's obviously some food cooking in that little pot. Little tiny pot, because the son of Ayash could smell that food too, and suddenly realizes, I'm hungry. And this, because the food smells good. And so she invites him. She says, "You must be hungry. I've been waiting for you, the son of Ayash, to arrive here. I've been expecting you." And then she tells him, eat some food, but you have to promise me you're going to finish all the food." And son of Ayash looks at that little pot and says, "That little pot, easy peasy." I'm putting it in modern day words here, contemporary words. And he kind of scoffs and says, "That little pot?" And so she tells him to start eating, and he starts eating, but the pot never empties. And he continues eating and eating and eating and eating and eating from that little pot until finally the pot is empty. And she tells him, "I know where you're going, and you're gonna need some tools for where you're going. And I'm gonna give you those tools." And so she gives him 3 tools that are gonna help him on his quest, his journey. And son of Ayash asks her, "Kokum, so how do I know when to use these?" And she says, "You'll know when you're gonna need them." So he sleeps for the night there and continues on his journey. And that part of that story really resonated for me, because, when stories are told, we take the information in storytelling. When we hear a story, we take information, what's going to help us from what we're hearing, or we connect some of the information to our own lived experience. And that's why these stories were told, because each time you would hear a story like what I just told you, you would get new information from the retelling of it, because sometimes more details were told each time. And I wanted to tell that one, because my takeaway in hearing that story was, we have to suspend our beliefs when we hear these kinds of stories that are like spirit stories. the Atsokan, we have to go with the story. And we do go with the story. No one's going to say, oh, a little hut underwater with smoke coming out of it. And, you know, we go with the story. And my takeaway from that story was that food that she fed him. We have teachers along the way in our paths that are gonna help us, you know, travel on our life paths, and we'll meet teachers. And that food that she asked him to eat, because I'm in research now, I think of it as knowledge. She fed him knowledge. Some of the spiritual knowledge. And then she gave him those tools, and she didn't tell him how to use them, what they were to be used for. She just told him, you'll know when the time comes how to use them. And that connects me back to the research that we do. And it connects me to the story, because story is about knowledge, about our knowledges and our worldview and our spiritual stories. And much like knowledge evolves, you know, why those stories were told again and again and again. And at different stages in our lives, more details were told. So if the story was told to a child, like a 3, 4, 5-year-old child, you know, some parts of the story would be left out until the storyteller recognized when those parts of the story could be told, particularly in some of the other stories that contain sexual content and are about sexuality. So anyways, I don't know if I diverged away from what I was intending to talk about, but those are the kinds of things that really support in research. They're my grounding, you know, when I think about our stories. And because I grew up hearing these stories, and so my body carries them. And we have blood memory, but we also have memory that our bodies carry, much like the earth has memories, carries that information, because that's why we have that strong connection to the land. And so all of these things intersect, you know, and story is really important because it's about connecting as human beings. When you hear the word Anishinaabe, quite often I'll say I'm Anishinaabe. I'm not saying I'm Ojibwe. I'm not saying I'm Odawa. I'm not saying I'm Bodwe Adami. I call myself Anishinaabe. What Anishinaabe actually means is the human that was lowered from the sky, so from the sky world. Anisna, Anish. Now, when you're lowering like a baby, you might say Ganisna Maba, Maba, and we have no gender as well. Maba is this little person, and so it's really about recognizing, it's acknowledging that we are Manado. We are spiritual beings. That's what Anishinaabe means. So I'll end with that.